Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. Up until the 1970s, the representation of African Americans in Hollywood films and cinema in general was pretty grim. They were usually in the most minimal roles, and when featured more prominently, they were either portrayed in the most negatively stereotypical way imaginable or in a manner that garnered the most maudlin sentimental sympathy. That changed as the 1970s dawned thanks to the advances in awareness due to the civil rights movement. With Ossie Davis's surprise hit film from 1970, Cotton Comes to Harlem, two black men were the lead protagonists in a story that took place in a black neighborhood, and the specter of racism from white law enforcement and the gangster underworld hung over the story. However, the real breakout happened 1 year later with the 1-2 punch of Melvin Van Peebles' indie cult classic, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, and the big budget MGM studio blockbuster Shaft. In both of these movies, it wasn't just African American characters pushed to the forefront as protagonists that engaged and excited black moviegoers from all over the country, nor was it just the themes of socioeconomic inequality and crime-ridden inner cities. It was the notion of the anti-hero. It was the idea that the quote-unquote good guys weren't necessarily fighting for truth, justice, or the rule of law, but more to protect their communities and their people from the systemic racism of the world that surrounded them, even if it meant bending the rules. This period in the 1970s was a pivotal moment in movie history when a misrepresented ethnic minority found their voice, their heroes, and their culture finally reflected back at them in a positive way via the medium of film. As for the actual quality of the films themselves in this movement that lasted through the late 1970s, let's just say it ranged widely. However, this is a music podcast, and what we intend to focus on with this episode is the actual music that comprised the soundtracks of these films, and more specifically, the best individual songs. Why? Quite simply, large swaths of the music from these movies constituted some of the very best R&B, soul, and funk music of the entire era and of all time. In our estimable opinion, the only essential soundtrack albums of the Blaxploitation period are Isaac Hayes' sublime OST for the 1971 movie Shaft and Curtis Mayfield's breathtakingly brilliant and powerful OST for the 1972 film Superfly. We already discussed the former in detail in our 1971 installment of our second Golden Age of Rock series, and the latter will be explored in all its majestic glory in our upcoming 1972 episode of the second Golden Age of Rock series. On this episode, we're simply focusing on the rest. And by the rest, we mean our picks for the best individual songs from the soundtracks of the 1970s Blaxploitation movement, non-Shaft, non-Superfly division. So slip on those bell-bottomed pants, put on that pimp hat, and slide into that polyester butterfly collared shirt as we're going to bring you back to a period of hot funk, hot soul, hot sex, and even hotter attitude. Welcome, baby, to this soul train called the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
So Arturo, are you ready to take a ride?
I'm always ready to take a ride into the 1970s and especially the Blaxploitation era. These movies aren't always great, but
Yeah.
some of them are underratedly good. But the most important part, of course, is the music. You know
Yeah, that's not quite the ride I was talking about though.
what
That
right are you
that's
talking
that's all valid. But
about?
we
Oh,
have a ride we need to take over to the other side of the space-time continuum before we get to
oh,
all the blaxploitation music.
oh. Okay,
Uh,
man.
uh,
I'm excited. I'm too excited, man.
yeah, of which there is plenty of great blaxploitation era music that we will be discussing. But before then, we need to take a detour into the parallel universe, baby.
Yeah.
It's a special place where blue is green and high is short and everything is wonderful and rock and roll still predominates on the billboards and on the cover of Rolling Stone and in the arenas and on your radio dial. It's a special time and guys in jean jackets are still like killer
Right.
and making promotional appearances and guys with like mustaches and long hair and jean jackets. That's what we want to see. That's the comeback we want to see. Anyway,
Well,
that's a fancy way of saying that the parallel universe is the segment where Arturo and I cover new and newish albums by
yes.
artists that we think deserve a greater platform and in a parallel universe would be awesome. And so,
Yes.
Arturo, who are you covering this on this episode of the Parallel Universe?
Yes, the British band King Hannah and their latest and second album, Big Swimmer. Now, Dry Cleaning are an up and coming young British rock band that draw from 1990s alternative rock with a front woman who eschews singing for abstract spoken word gibberish. Well, think of King Hannah, another up and coming young British band, as Dry Cleaning if Dry Cleaning were actually good. One of the reasons they're better is because King Hannah's front woman, Hannah Merrick, does indeed delve in spoken word vocals, but they're in no way abstract or gibberish. She tells stories, and more specifically to this album, impressionistic snapshots of events that happened to them on their last US tour when they were opening for Thurston Moore in support of their debut album. Songs like New York, Let's Do Nothing, Somewhere Near El Paso, and other tracks referencing Philadelphia, flying hotel mattresses, and having lonely dinners on the road, as beautifully evoked in the country ballad John Prine on the Radio, add to the sense of constant travel and displacement. And Merrick doesn't just do spoken word. She quite often sings in a sultry, compelling contralto in the choruses that make you wish she would actually do it all the time. Whereas their first album from 2 years ago, I'm Not Sorry, I Was Just Being Me, was uneven and spread out thin by relying a little too much on their 1990s influences, especially with the Portishead worship. Big Swimmer is a much more cohesive, full-blooded rock in capital letters ROCK album with tighter songwriting that still enables the music to stretch out and elongate without meandering. This is mainly due to guitarist Craig Whittle, the other half of King Hannah's creative core, leading a tight rhythm section that is produced as crisply, as loudly, and as no nonsense as possible. Recorded mostly live in the studio with very few overdubs, a keyboard here, maybe a synthesizer there, buried under the prevalent guitar bass drums mix. On this album, King Hannah evokes Neil Young if he exchanged Crazy Horse for the post-rock band Slint,
Uh,
particularly on the track Milk Boy, I Love You, and the stripped-down minimalism of late 1980s, 1990s Lou Reed. There is nothing indie, quote unquote, about this album, and this is hands down, to me, one of the best pure rock records of the year. Chris?
yeah, I'm okay with this record. I think there are some good songs on it. I'm a big fan of New York, Let's Do Nothing.
Yeah.
I think that's a very funny song, and it actually, you and I having lived in New York City a long time ago, can kind of appreciate the vibe
Right.
that it really does. The best times in New York are when you actually do nothing except kind of hang out. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's always fun. My only complaint with this record is I think it's a little samey in the sense that a lot of the songs follow this dynamic where
Mm.
they start soft, then they get a little louder, then they get a little louder, and then they get really loud, but the tempos never change.
Right.
And some of these last 7, 8 minutes, and it goes on for multiple songs in a row in a sequence, and
Mhm.
it stands out a little too much, and it's a little bit too much of an annoyance for me to give this a full-hearted endorsement.
Right.
But there are some pretty good songs, and there's some pretty gnarly guitar
Right.
going on in this record too. So
Yeah.
a lot to like. I just wish it wasn't quite as samey.
Hmm. Okay. All right. So, Chris, what's your choice?
Oh yes. So my choice is an interesting one. We're extending far beyond King Hannah into more of an outer space kind of vibe.
Hmm.
This is the band Wand. And Wand, for a while in the 2010s was one of the more prolific bands of its type. It released 5 albums between 2014 and 2019. Uh, they're ostensibly an experimental garage rock quartet from Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Calling them garage rock nowadays is pretty reductive, though. They've graduated from their early days of rocking out about flying golems and dungeon droppers and sounding a lot like late period OCs to become
Yeah.
one of the more interesting and eclectic bands in all of underground rock. And this new album, Vertigo, it's their first album in 5 years after a long hiatus. And after that prolific period that I talked about, where they became one of the more engaging underground rock bands in the country. So they're back. And again, the name of the album is Vertigo. And so uh, they're interesting because now they mix a whole lot of different styles into an engaging brew. I mean, they're part grunge, part psychedelia, part ambient, part industrial, part shoegazer, part post rock with reggae and EDM touches thrown in. Basically, think of a bastard child between Neil Young, Kid A era Radiohead, and late 80s post rock, and you get what Wand has become. On this new album, they get especially wonky. It's probably a step down from the last time we heard them on 2019's Laughing Matter.
Good
When they,
album, by the way.
yeah, very good album. When they presented a freewheeling but tuneful romp of eclecticism over the course of 67 minutes. But here they do keep it to a more economical 8 songs in 39 minutes, and they still mostly get it right. This is an excellent song cycle that has grown on me with each listen. The only real misfire is track 3, a sort of electronic reggae song called Mistletoe that devolves into formless electro weirdness over its final minute. But the rest is strong, and its best approach is majestic. Highlights include the opening 2 song suite Hangman and Curtain Call that finds bandleader Corey Hansen making like Tom York with a vocal that soars over a bed of tightly wound, skittering guitar riffs and a slithering bass line. There's also the album's first single, Smile, which is a straight up Crazy Horse style garage rocker. This band is at its best when it cranks up the guitars.
Yep.
Plus,
Yep.
there's the relentless brutal bash out called High Time, which builds itself on a cacophony of guitar noise that neatly and wonderfully transforms into the rhythmic backbone of an otherwise sensual as hell song. None of the songs here have the edginess and learned inertia of the best stuff on Laughing Matter, but again, after the 5 year layoff, a 3 3/4 star effort is pretty good. I'm curious to see and to hear what this band does next. They are certainly content to be discontent with the status quo. Arturo, what say you?
I'm generally a fan of this band, especially the early stuff. Their first album, Gang Lion Reef, and their greatest album is Gollum from 2015. Their early sound is fantastic. They were like basically if if the evolution of heavy metal went from Cream, skipping Led Zeppelin straight to Black Sabbath and injecting it with a shitload of LSD and psychedelia,
Yeah.
and of course songs about goblins and witches and
Yeah,
things
yeah,
like
yeah. Early Wand is definitely like garage stoner rock.
Yeah, really. And great. Gollum is a perfect record. And then, like a lot of bands, when they decide to change their sound, they go into this transition period where the music is not so good. Now, albums like 1000 Days and Plum from 2017, which they're just really reaching and striving for something and not really getting it. Okay. But they finally got it on 2019's Laughing Matter, which was a very good record. I describe it as this hybrid of art rock and jam band music
Yeah.
with like slight psychedelia in it. As for the new album, Vertigo, I have to admit I'm not really a fan of it. I love the single Smile. That's one of the best rock singles of the year. You
Yeah.
compared it to Neil Young. It's interesting. I don't really hear Neil Young that much. I hear like My Bloody Valentine at their most tuneful. And that's
Yeah.
probably my biggest complaint about Vertigo is that it's just a lot of, to me, most of the record is just really generic cliche shoegazer without the songwriting to back it up. I think this is more of a sound record than a songs record.
Yeah,
And
which is a fair comment.
right. And that's because Laughing Matter had some great songs, the previous album from 5 years ago. So it's a little disappointing that they went this road, not sound wise, just the lack of songs. But hey, Smile's a kick-ass song.
Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming.
So, earlier in this episode, at the very beginning, we call it the parameter setter segment, I spoke about the Blaxploitation movie movement and this era of the 1970s that we're talking about, why it was important, why it mattered. But that's my opinion. Chris, give us your little rumination on the Blaxploitation movie era.
Yeah, what Blaxploitation really is about, it's basically rebel movies.
Yeah.
And it's a rebel narrative made for a specific audience of black folks that weren't quite used to seeing heroes and anti-heroes that were black that succeeded. That, I have read accounts of when Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song first came out in 1971. That audiences, the end of the movie basically is the Sweetback, the protagonist, escaping and running off into the expanse. Like, basically,
Spoiler for those who haven't seen it.
audiences went nuts. They absolutely went bonkers. Like, you're talking standing ovations that lasted for minutes. People, absolute just cheering, pandemonium, wild response to that.
Yeah.
And so people hadn't seen that.
Yeah.
And they weren't used to that. So I think that that was exciting, and it was in some ways subversive. And one of the things about Blaxploitation films too is that they kind of played on the I think they had great fun playing on the fears of white people.
Yeah.
In terms of some of the black stereotypes and of sort of the danger. And so, so we're presenting anti-heroes, but they're anti-heroes that would appeal to black folks that, that see these folks in their neighborhood getting one over on systemic racism, but they're enough to scare white people.
Yeah.
And, we'll get into some of that with some of the funny marketing of some of these films. And so there's that. And then the other legacy is the music.
Yeah.
That what happened is starting with Shaft, really, when Isaac Hayes did that soundtrack, what you ended up with is it opened a door for all these brilliant black artists to contribute the music to these movies. And the music is a hell of a lot more lasting than the movies themselves. Most of the movies have a certain melodrama to them. A lot of these movies are either cheesy or melodramatic.
Right.
And when you watch them, you laugh because because of the self-seriousness of it. Either the self-seriousness of them or the complete lack of obliviousness, or the complete obliviousness to just how cheesy things are.
Right.
And so the movies you'll forget, the music you will not. And
And
so
that's why we're doing this episode.
and that is exactly why we're doing this episode. So
Yeah.
so that's the legacy. You're talking about one of the preeminent rebel film art forms of all time.
Right.
And it's wonderful.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I actually am a genuine fan of some of these movies. I think Trouble Man, we'll get to that soon. I actually think it's a really good movie. But anyway, one thing we need to really mention is that there are two particular soundtracks: Isaac Hayes' Shaft soundtrack and Curtis Mayfield's Superfly soundtrack. We are not talking about songs from these soundtracks on this list because, well, on the previous one of our previous episodes, the 1971 episode of the Second Golden Age of Rock series, we already talked about Shaft, and we will talk about Curtis Mayfield's Superfly in the next episode, the 1972 episode of the Second Golden Age of Rock series. We don't talk about, and the other reason we don't talk about songs from those albums, because those two soundtracks are essential albums, capital A. And they need to be listened to on their own. Those are two of the greatest albums ever made. Those are the towering albums.
And we couldn't do them justice by giving them a cursory treatment. On this, they need their own episode essentially.
Right. Exactly.
And to get it right.
We did it with Shaft, and we're going to do that with Superfly. And those are albums that need to be spoken about in their entirety. So basically, all these great Blaxploitation songs that we're going to recommend to you, it's the non-Shaft, non-Superfly division.
Yep, which is a pretty strong division. And I think what do we have? 26 songs overall.
26.
Yep. And so, with that said, let us start the lightning and thunder of Blaxploitation, Lollapalooza, baby.
It's right. Starting with Melba Moore and her song Black Enough, and in parentheses, ain't now, but it's gonna be, from the movie Cotton Comes to Harlem from 1970, specifically written by Gate McDermott for the soundtrack to Ossie Davis's Cotton Comes to Harlem, quite possibly the first bona fide Blaxploitation film. It's a lush, groovy, mid-tempo R&B soul at its finest and most empowering. And empowering is the key word, as this is a Black Power anthem done with a velvet touch and an emotional wallop. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very cinematic. I mean, and not only that, but I think there's an obvious Morricone influence in the instrumentation of this song. And it has that. Remember, this is 1970, so this is practically like late 60s kind of stuff. Yeah. And so it has that sound and it has that aesthetic. The thing I love about it most is it's got just a silly lyric. It talks about a pea green sea of humanity. I don't necessarily know if I want to see a pea green sea of humanity, because that sounds like everybody's been puked on.
We're 3 years away from The Exorcist, so
yeah, exactly. Either that or everybody's been on You Can't Say That on Television and it's been slimed.
All right, the next one, Earth, Wind, and Fire. You might have heard of them. With the song Sweetback's Theme from Sweetback's Badass Song from 1971. Melvin Van Peebles, who wrote, directed, produced, and starred in this film, whose budget was $150,000 but earned $15 million in the box office. Now that's a profit. Commissioned a little-known band named Earth, Wind, and Fire to play the music that Van Peebles himself composed for the film. Very much inspired by the languid, loungy R&B of Booker T and the MGs. This is a 7.5-minute jam with a trancy keyboard riff riding the groove, while some delicious alto saxophone soloing glides above it all before the keyboard riff itself slides into a solo. Yes, it works great as background music to a chase scene, as it was used in the movie, but it also works as meditative headphone music. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Meditative headphone music to the end. It's got that it's slightly lightly funky,
Yeah.
and it's interesting to hear this sort of primitive earth, wind, and fire where you don't get the vocals. So you don't get the falsetto and you don't get Maurice White's vocals. But Maurice White can't help himself but fits in one of those like full ass horn arrangements
Yeah.
in the middle of it. So
Yeah.
it's like it's not quite a Van Peebles thing
Yeah.
when Maurice White is adding his own touches in. So it's a funky little nugget,
Mhm.
and it's a fun song, and it basically got Earth, Wind, and Fire their start.
Yeah, it really did. All right. Next, Donny Hathaway with Little Ghetto Boy from the movie Come Back Charleston Blue from 1972. Quincy Jones collaborated with Hathaway on this soulful groover from the sequel to Cotton Comes to Harlem. The influence of the heavily percussive yet strident flows of Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, combined with Hathaway's patented jazzy chord progressions to deliver a plea for poor inner city youth to transcend their surroundings and build a life for themselves with a desperation and optimism that matches the best of Curtis Mayfield. Chris?
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that while Hathaway is listed as the composer and conductor
Yeah.
on most of the songs on this album, he didn't write this song.
No, not
This
his
is
song. Right.
yeah, so this is one of the songs he did not write. But as you said, Quincy Jones basically produced it, and Hathaway did the arrangement and conducted. And so in that sense, it is kind of like Donnie and Quincy
Mm,
supervising it, kind of like the way that like Quincy and Michael Jackson would supervise other people's work
right.
years later.
Right.
And like you said, I think that what happened in 1971 is the world became very safe for the conga and the flute
Yeah.
after what's going on. What's going
Yeah.
on just kind of opened up a door for a lot of people, and so I think that really had an influence on Hathaway. And like you said, Hathaway does have his jazzy chord progressions, and so it's a heck of a song. And again, it's kind of like it's Donnie's take on Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" is what I see it as.
Basically. Yeah, exactly. A slightly jazzier What's Going On. All right, next. Bobby Womack with Across 110th Street from the movie Across 110th Street from 1972. The song was released as a single in January 73, but the movie came out in late 72. This is the first of two songs we spoke about in a previous episode, counting down the best songs about New York City. Please check it out in our archive if you get a chance. Womack really was one of the most underrated singer-songwriters of R&B soul music of this era. And the clavinet, popularized earlier in the year by Stevie Wonder's Superstition, is put to great effect here as Womack vividly describes the crime and poverty of this area of Harlem. However, he doesn't glorify it as much as he gives an impassioned plea to be strong, survive, and rise against the odds, much like the previous Donny Hathaway song. It doesn't hurt that the track has a soaring, hooky, anthemic chorus that drives the song home. Chris?
Oh yeah, this song is totally anthemic, and it's just a really well done song, and it's interesting that it comes from Bobby Womack because Womack had been around for years. You
Yeah.
remember he was the lead singer of the Valentinos. He also was Sam Cooke's backing guitar player for a long time, and so this.
Yeah, Womack also wrote It's All Over Now that the Rolling Stones popularized in 1964.
Hey, go figure. So yeah, so he had a history before this, and so this is kind of a reinvention for him. And it's interesting because it's a super serious and super sobering song that's in the midst of like one of the most over the top, cheesily melodramatic blaxploitation films of them all.
I
It's
like it. I like the movie. I think it's all right. I think
yeah,
it's okay.
it's crime drama with an emphasis on the drama. And it's worth mentioning, by the way, that the song is more famous for its use in Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown
Yeah, yeah.
at the beginning of the movie when Pam Grier, who is still smoking hot at age 48, is walking through the airport
Yeah.
after getting off her stewardess shift, and it makes for one of the better opening credit sequences of the last 30 years, probably. And
Right.
so that's what it's more famous for.
Next, Jimmy Cliff with The Harder They Come from the movie The Harder They Come, also from 1972. Now, why is it that a movie that was made in Jamaica featuring all reggae music counts as a blaxploitation film? Well, let's see. A black protagonist who finds himself waging a nearly one-man war against a political and economic system that subjugates him and the criminal underworld that exploits him? Check. A stark and vivid portrayal of socioeconomic disparity and poverty and what it does to society? Check. The protagonist himself being an anti-hero who fights back against the odds stacked against him by delving into the criminal underworld himself and using the tricks of the trade to his advantage, a la the priest character in the movie Superfly? Check. It doesn't have to be African American for it to be blaxploitation. As for the song itself, it's one of Cliff's greatest singles and one of the most famous reggae anthems ever. As with Curtis Mayfield in the Superfly soundtrack, Cliff imbues the song, the track, with a humanity and a message of self-empowerment that transcends the nihilistic nature of the actual movie. Chris?
Yeah. Like I said, one of these things is not like the other. I mean, as I think is one of the things you could say about this song. But yeah, you're right. It definitely belongs on the list because, yeah, The Harder They Come is about as blaxploitation as it gets
Yeah.
in form. And so it's interesting to note, by the way, that The Harder They Come comes in at number 350 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it places high up there, and it should because it is. It's got that easy listening reggae vibe to it, and it's certainly more bearable than I can see now. I can see clearly now.
Oh, that song made it to so many TV commercials.
Yeah, it sold a lot of orange juice in its time.
Jimmy Cliff made a lot of money from licensing with that one. Woo!
Yeah,
All right.
and so this song is much more bearable than that.
Yeah. Next, Marvin Gaye with Trouble Man from the soundtrack to the movie Trouble Man from 1972. The movie itself was both a commercial and critical disappointment, especially since it was produced by major studio 20th Century Fox. Personally, I think it's one of the most underrated movies of the blaxploitation era. But more importantly, it has a terrific score and soundtrack of original songs, all done by one of the giants of 20th century R&B. Sultry, smoky, jazzy, with a haunting piano riff and a truly indelible vocal performance. It's Gaye's incredible lyrics that bring the song's world-weary weight. Telling a woman not to worry about his dangerous lifestyle, the narrator ensures her that trouble and hard times is all he's ever known, and they aren't going to stop him now that he's achieved some measure of self-respect and success. As Baron Helmut Zero tells Bucky Barnes in the Marvel-produced Disney Plus series The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, it captures the African-American experience in one song. Chris?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that given that, and it's kind of autobiographical too, because obviously Gaye courted a lot of trouble in his life.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, he was kind of a trouble magnet, and so that's kind of poignant there, and this kind of continues Gaye's newfound freedom. He had that newfound artistic freedom and what's going on the year before, and so this kind of continues that. And it still has that lounge feel, but it's more of a blues jazz hybrid. And it's got a wonderful lyric, by the way. There's only three things that's for show: taxes, death, and trouble. Oh, yeah. So I enjoy that. And so this may be actually objectively the best song on this entire list.
Maybe. Quite possibly. Quite possibly. All right, next. Billy Preston with Slaughter from the movie Slaughter, the Jim Brown vehicle from 1972. Like I said, it's a vehicle for former NFL legend Jim Brown, and it features a nasty slice of black rock with wah-wah pedal guitars, fuzz tone guitars, clavinet, and crazy-ass organ fills swirling together in a tornado of badass slamma-jamma jamming. Chris?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's a wacky ass song. You got awesome bass line and organ riff. It's like basically it's like heavy metal gospel. Billy Preston at this point in 1972 and 73 was mostly doing gospel songs.
Yeah.
And he was mostly riffing on gospel music
Right.
of, but the Black Church songs of all stripes kind of were coming into his act through his keyboards and through his organs and through a lot of what he was doing. And it shows up here. And this is the part of the episode where I have to do a public service and I have to point people to the greatest thing on the internet by far. On YouTube, there's an old broadcast of a show called Soul.
Yeah.
This was a public television show, cable access show that was on in the early 70s in New York City.
Late 60s. It was late 60s, actually, when it started. It's a precursor to Soul Train.
Yeah. And this episode aired on February 28th, 1973. And it features Billy Preston giving a concert, giving most of his gospel stuff. But there's a small studio audience dancing to it. And it's just Billy at the height of his powers with his band, just rocking the fuck out. It is the single best thing on the internet. I love it. And Billy Preston is just awesome. Awesome talent, awesome afro, awesome, quasi gospel singer, and creator of an awesome Blaxploitation song in Slaughter.
Yeah. And he's one of the few people to play with both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Right.
And Dennis Wilson.
And Dennis Wilson. There you go. Next, Jerry Butler and Jerry Peters with Melinda title theme from the movie Melinda, 1972. Talk about melodramatic movies. This is one of them. But the music, whew. And now for silky smooth sounds of the 70s. This is lush, decadent, orchestral R&B at its lushest and most decadent. A string arrangement that just screams sex, combines with some gloriously sleazy saxophone and lightly wah-wah pedal guitars to orgasmic effect. Chris?
Gee, was this song featured in a movie? Yeah, it's obviously made for the screen. It's obviously a love theme to a movie. No getting around that. And it's music to get your groove on too. Sexy as hell. And again, the Marvin Gaye influence is pretty apparent. It's pretty clear that Gaye opened up a musical palette that was definitely followed for several years after what's going on.
Sure.
Huge influence. And a beautiful sax soloist for what it's worth, but the choral vocals are pretty overwrought. That's the one complaint.
Yeah.
But it's still beautiful. But it's cinematic as hell. One of the more cinematic, not the most cinematic, but one of the most cinematic pieces of music on this whole list.
Yeah. Next, Solomon Burke with Hammer from the movie Hammer from 1972. The first of back-to-back songs by Burke on this list. This stands out because it contrasts so much with the sound Burke was most known for, which was deeply gospel-infused soul and heroic vocal emoting. This, however, is supersized funk with an outsized horn arrangement and a guitar practically strangling the wah-wah pedal. It sounds like the theme song to a Saturday morning cartoon featuring a Black Power superhero fighting for a movie about a professional boxer who goes after the mob by taking the law into his own hands. It's basically a vigilante movie, but the song matches. Chris?
Yeah, it does. I mean, this is phony James Brown to the end, for sure. And the song is a trip because it's got that spooky reverb, man.
Yeah.
And it's got the fighting noises that come in halfway through. It's got, Burke basically scream singing.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny. And again, for a movie that was a star vehicle for Fred Williamson, it's a pretty appropriate piece of music. But then, like I said, phony James Brown to the end.
Yep. Next, Solomon Burke again with Get Up and Do Something for Yourself from the movie Cool Breeze from 1972. This is no more in Burke's usual musical wheelhouse than the previous song, but at least Burke's voice sounds more like himself and not some crazed shouter. The horn section is punchy as all hell, and the complex rhythm arrangement doesn't alienate the listener, but rather augments the tasty guitar licks and bass lines. Chris?
Yeah, more phony James Brown. Burke was a gospel singer by background, but he was a first-rate funk screamer too, as we
Yeah.
said. And I love a lyric from this song. I don't ask nobody to help me when I'm making love.
Okay.
Yeah, which is kind of funny because Burke was kind of a fat guy, so maybe he did need some help.
Yeah, and he got fatter as he got older too. All
Yep.
right. Speaking of James Brown, up next is James Brown with Down and Out in New York City from the movie Black Caesar from 1973. This is the second of two songs that we previously covered in our episode counting down the greatest songs ever written about or taking place in New York. Like with Solomon Burke before, one of the things that makes this song notable is how so unlike this track is from what Brown was doing at the time, which was bad to the bone, stripped down funk. This is the godfather of soul acquiescing to Blaxploitation music of the day. That is, stirring string arrangements and a bombastic and driving horn section. But most importantly of all, this is Brown actually singing with
Yep.
force and conviction about the plight of poor Black people in inner urban areas. Known for his grunts, screams, screeches, and glorified onomatopoeia, Brown was actually one of the finest, most emotive, most convincing R&B singers of all time. Chris?
Yeah, why settle for phony James Brown when you can get the real goddamn thing? And it's worth noting, Brown did not write this song.
No, he
It
didn't.
was written by two guys named Bodie Chandler and Barry DeVorzon.
Mm,
But it becomes a James Brown song in the arrangement.
yeah.
You put it in the hands of James Brown and trombonist Fred Wesley,
Yeah.
who basically was the band leader for the JBs. Put
Yeah.
them together, and they come up with. They basically invented black marching music. It's marching music for young African American people,
Yeah.
and it's that wonderful interaction with the horns and the woodwinds. And it just that thump, that and so it's more songy than what
Yeah.
Brown had been doing for several years before that, but it still has that thump and it still has that rhythm workout that he had been doing. So it's kind of it is in his wheelhouse, but it is more tuneful. And so and it really kind of started a comeback for Brown towards more songy songs
Right.
as opposed
Right.
to the more funk workouts.
Yeah.
So worth mentioning, it actually reached 50 on the Hot 100 and number 13 on the R&B chart.
That's modern. For his standards at the time, that was pretty low, actually.
Yeah, that was a moderate hit.
Yeah. All right. Next, Joe Simon with theme from Cleopatra Jones from the movie Cleopatra Jones from 1973. The movie that brought Black feminism to a mainstream audience is also the only movie that provides two songs on this list. This one is a banger with a killer bass line that throbs throughout and a tension-filled rhythm that builds until the horns and strings explode in the chorus. Chris?
Yeah, and I gotta say, Joe Simon kind of sounds like Barney from The Simpsons. Yeah, baby, you move.
I know.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. So I can't help but think of Barney the Drunk. But Joe Simon was pretty successful. He had a couple R&B hits with Gamble and Huff, Drowning in the Sea of Love and The Power of Love before this.
Right.
And he gets into this song, and it's like you said, it's not a sensual song. This is an outright sexual song.
Yeah.
And there is a sexuality to a lot of this music that is just really, really striking because
Yeah.
it is so horn dog in
Right.
some of these songs are so horn dog, and they're just off the charts with that, including the next song from the same movie.
Yeah. Millie Jackson with It Hurts So Good, also from Cleopatra Jones. One of the most underrated soul singers of the 1970s. Seriously, her 1974 album, Caught Up, is a tour de force and one of the best albums ever. And here she delivers this slow burning ode to the pain of love. This period of R&B soul music is never better when the fervor of gospel is transplanted to lust and desire of the heart. Chris?
Yep, this is Great Phony Staple Singers,
Yeah.
and reached number 3 on the R&B charts, Billboard R&B charts. And it's even sexier than the Joe Simon song
Yeah, it
because
is.
because it matches sensuality with id and it
Right.
just has real purpose. And there's a gospel glory to the chorus, but this is lovemaking music essentially.
Yeah.
This is essentially what this is. So it makes me want to see Cleopatra Jones because Cleopatra Jones must be a sexy ass movie.
On this episode, we talked about the best songs from 1970s Blaxploitation film soundtracks. For the next episode, we're going to conclude our second Golden Age of Rock series as we explore the year 1972. Why end it on this year? Well, this is the year that marked the end of the 1960s hangover and when the 1970s really kick-started into high gear. Rock albums that defined the rest of the decade were released this year by artists and bands such as David Bowie, Roxy Music, Neu!, Can, The Eagles, Neil Young, Lou Reed, Deep Purple, Yes, Elton John, and Todd Rundgren. Picking up where Sly Stone and Marvin Gaye left off, Curtis Mayfield, Stevie Wonder, and Al Green put out records that lifted the bar for R&B, soul, and funk even higher. And a particular British Pantheon band produced arguably the greatest rock and roll album ever made. Join us next time in the Curmudgeon Rock Report as we will bring you the second golden age of rock, 1972. All right, now we're in the second half of the best songs of the 1970s Blaxploitation era from those soundtracks. Okay, we did 13. We got 13 more to go. This next song is by Roy Ayers with Coffee is the Color from the movie Coffee from 1973. Another slice of Black power from the female perspective. The movie's about a badass nurse who exacts vigilante justice on the criminal underworld responsible for her sister's death and served as Pam Grier's introduction to mainstream moviegoers. Ayers' soundtrack to the film provides this snappy, bass-rich, vibraphone-driven dance track. Considering Ayers' jazz background, it does kind of sound like early Steely Dan if Steely Dan were black. Chris?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, give it up for the vibraphone solo, man. You know,
Yeah.
who knew that vibraphone could be that funky?
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think it's got the song has the camp and the pomp that really suits the Pam Grier sex bomb badass persona.
Yeah.
And so I think it's befitting of a Pam Grier film. So good on Roy Ayers for getting it right. It's a funk light workout and the vibraphone. Gotta love it.
I love it. Next, Badder Than Evil, that's the name of the band, with Hot Wheels, in parentheses, The Chase, from the movie Gordon's War from 1973. One of the few songs on this list by a full band. The full band, the funk band we're talking about, Badder Than Evil, show exquisite interplay between the guitar and bass on this tense, blistering track that serves as the extended music for a chase scene of another blaxploitation movie about, you guessed it, vigilante justice against drug lords. Chris?
Yeah. Badder Than Evil might be my new favorite band song.
Title, name for a band, yeah.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, it really doesn't get much better than that because think about it. They're not worse than evil. They're not more evil than evil. They're badder than evil, brother. Yeah. We badder than evil. That's why we're gonna defeat evil because we badder. That's just great. And yeah, killer riffage on this song, Booty Shaker Supreme. It's almost Afrobeatish in some respects, you know, because it has that kind of groove to it, and it might also count as primitive disco.
Maybe.
I mean, you're talking like 1973. It has kind of a disco-ish, like dancey vibe to it. So it's a hell of a song. It's a hell of an instrumental to have a car chase to.
Yeah. All right. Next, Edwin Starr with Ain't It Hell Up in Harlem from the movie Hell Up in Harlem from 1973. Most known for his work with the funk band War, who had big hits with the songs War and Spill the Wine with Eric Burdon. Starr came out on his own on the soundtrack to this sequel to Black Caesar, a rumination on the desperation of the poor underclass in inner cities has never sounded as jubilant and celebratory in this souped up, funked up scorcher. Chris?
Yeah, it's one of the few songs on this list that it doesn't really sound like a celebration. It's it actually does kind of convey the pain of the situation.
Mm.
You know, I mean, Across 110th Street does in some ways too. But this song, it doesn't sound like a celebration. It doesn't sound like a dance party. It actually sounds like it's pent up frustration and rage coming out. And so that's I think is what makes it more interesting than some of the other songs on this list. And Edwin Starr was good. You know, he would really hit it out of the park with this one.
Yeah. Next, Don Julian with title theme, Savage, from the movie Savage, with an exclamation point, from 1973. One of the unrenowned figures of the Blaxploitation film movement was Cirio H. Santiago, a Filipino director who networked his strong relationship with the king of American B-movies, Roger Corman, to make several movies in the genre, all, of course, of the low-budget variety, and all made in the Philippines. Savage is one of them, and this truly awful movie about a gang of criminals and outcasts who rise up to take on a corrupt South American government nevertheless features the longest song on this list. Mostly famous for his R&B soul music in the 1960s, Julian's contribution to the 1970s was this revved up soundtrack that produced this epic, sprawling funk jam that doesn't let up nor lose the listener with its multi-section structure. This is dense, relentless, progressive funk. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. 10 minutes and 29 seconds long. The flute is out in full force.
Yeah.
The drums are just to kick ass. There's like several drum solos. And
several.
Yeah, several drum solos in a span of 10 minutes, 29 seconds. And there's lots of movements and a lot of movement. And one thing to share, I found the movie poster for Savage.
Yeah.
And well, first off, this song, it basically it sounds like it's trying to encapsulate a 2-hour action movie in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's really rousing. It's like the one song on this list that truly makes me want to see its film because of that energy. But I managed to find the poster for this song, and no joke, this was the slogan that they used on the poster. On the streets or on the sheets, he's a savage. Geez, playing up the stereotypes there, ain't we a little bit?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. On the streets or on the sheets, he's a savage.
He's a savage. Jeez.
Yeah.
All right. Next, speaking of movies that pander to stereotypes, Shaft in Africa. Next, this is Johnny Pate with Shaft in Africa, parentheses, Addis, which is the city in one of the countries in Africa, from the movie Shaft in Africa from 1973. The 1971 movie Shaft was so successful that 2 more sequels were made, each one worse than the previous one. Someone forgot to say this to composer Johnny Pate, who produced some stupendous music for this film, none more so than this track. One of the juiciest horn sections and arrangements you'll ever hear is on it, as are the multiple rhythmic breaks that evoke the Afrobeat music that Fela Kuti was starting to popularize around this time. Chris?
Yeah, it's the drum breaks that make this song. I really wouldn't be surprised if some of those early hip hop DJs served up one of these breaks on the turntable. I could see like Cool Herc doing a merry-go-round with some of these drum breaks. I mean, they're that fat and that good. Yeah. And just the funny part though is if you're gonna have like a theme for Shaft in Africa, shouldn't it be a lot more African though? There's no hint of Africa in Shaft in Africa's theme song.
There's something inherently wrong with that man.
Well, we get a little more African with the next track. This is Osibisa with Brotherhood from the movie Superfly TNT from 1973. Another sequel that was vastly inferior to the original. This movie soundtrack features this absolute ass-shaking Afro-funk monster. Osibisa were a band of Nigerian and Ghanaian musicians who met in London and achieved considerable success with their powerful hybrid brand of jazz, funk, and the rhythms indigenous to their native countries. They did the whole soundtrack to this movie, and like with the Curtis Mayfield soundtrack to the original Superfly, they created music that made you forget the movie. Chris?
Yep, which is probably a good thing. More African than Shaft in Africa, yo. That's an actual African song. Still funky as hell. Killer horn arrangement. Like you said, the band was part Ghanaian and part Nigerian and also part Caribbean. They had a Caribbean member or two. And so a lot of different polyrhythm influences that show up here. And it's pretty rollicking. It's one of my favorite songs on this list because it is so unique.
Yeah, I'm a big Osibisa fan. I have all their peak period 1970s albums.
Yeah,
All right, next.
I'll have to explore them a little bit more.
Yeah,
I'm not as familiar.
They were genuinely awesome. All right, next. Two in a row by Willie Hutch. The first one by Willie Hutch is Theme of the Mac from the movie The Mac from 1973. One of Richard Pryor's first movies. The soundtrack to this film about an ex-convict who seeks money and power by becoming a pimp gave us this stomper of a track. The jazzy, shimmering, ethereal introduction soon bursts into a full-throttle horns and strings attack with irresistible female vocal accompaniment echoing the dit-dit-dit horn riff. One of the best songs ever written about the joys of pimping. Chris?
Yeah, it's a short genre. The thing about Willie Hutch, it's worth mentioning that he's most famous as a Motown guy. He wrote the lyrics to the Jackson 5's "I'll Be There."
Oh, wow.
And he joined the Motown Hit Factory line and was part of the house band in 73, 74. So that's kind of his background. And then he was able to have some success in doing this soundtrack and the one we're going to talk about, we'll talk about next. Yeah, this song is fun because, like I said, you get that intro, which is like a romance ballad with this big luscious trumpet solo. And then it just takes off and it becomes this rocket ship of a romp. You know, it's fabulous. Yeah. And so, yeah, Hutch was a talent, but the next song we're going to talk about is even better and is about 400 times funnier, which I'll explain.
Yeah, Willie Hutch again with theme from Foxy Brown from 1974 of the movie Foxy Brown. Hutch must have been an in-demand soundtrack provider because he's back 1 year later with the music for this Pam Grier vehicle. On this song, you can hear the funk start giving way to something resembling what would eventually be the disco beat. This song is also the music to the opening credits of the movie, one of the most colorful and, with Pam Grier dancing around in all kinds of outfits, one of the sexiest opening credits ever. Chris?
Yeah, the thing about this song that I love is that I almost wonder if like Willie actually saw this movie before he wrote this song, because there's a lyric in it where he says, "You're the kind of woman a man needs around." Well, considering that Pam Grier's character, Foxy Brown, blows the head off of a guy with a shotgun, I'm not exactly sure that any of the men in this movie actually want Foxy Brown around, because she'll blow your ass off with a fucking shotgun. And then at the end of the song, before it hits the overture part, he says, "Whatever you do, don't let him down." I'm like, I don't think Foxy Brown gives a fuck about letting the guys down.
Yeah,
because she's just badass. That's a funny movie, by the way. Yeah, the whole shtick with the airplane and Sid Haig and just everything about it is just funny. Enjoyable.
All right, next. Gladys Knight and the Pips with On and On from the movie Claudine from 1974. The great Curtis Mayfield wrote all the music for the soundtrack to this Blaxploitation drama, and this song features all the traits of Mayfield brilliance: a snappy staccato drum rhythm, a meltingly groovy bass line, a slinky guitar riff, and an earworm hook for the chorus. Put the great voice of Gladys Knight on it, and you have a song that cannot possibly go wrong. Chris?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's Gladys Knight singing Curtis Mayfield, and
Yeah.
and what it does is, Mayfield being the writer for somebody else, he shows some restraint
Yeah.
because the guitar lick and the fuzz bass are more restrained than they are on stuff like If There's a Hell Below, We're All Gonna Go,
Right.
and some of the stuff from Roots. But it's still clearly Curtis Mayfield. It's still clearly the Curtis Mayfield template. And so it is kind of a trip to hear Gladys Knight singing over that template. So that's a pretty special combination, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Another special composer, Isaac Hayes, with Title Theme from the movie Three Tough Guys from 1974. Hayes returned to Blaxploitation soundtracks with this film, and from it comes this incessant four-to-the-floor banger of heavy soul. Hayes was the master of the perfect unison interplay between horn and string arrangements. Chris?
Yeah, and well, I love the opening of this song where he has where he has the cymbal, he has the hi-hat going, and then and
Yeah.
then you hear that wow wow wow,
Yeah.
that sort of roaring thing, but combined with the hi-hat, it's just like, and then it goes into the strings and horns, and so Hayes just has had a real gift for this movie music racket, didn't he?
Oh, it really did.
He just knew how to write music for films that they were just evocative and exciting,
Right.
and he really did. And so, great stuff.
Next is Isaac Hayes again with the song main title from the movie Truck Turner from 1974. Hayes was a busy man this year because after the soundtrack to Three Tough Guys, he jumped into not only writing the soundtrack for Truck Turner, but also starring in the film himself about a bounty hunter who gets involved in some nasty business. Hayes's music isn't usually known for its aggressive bass lines and tension building dynamics, but he pulls out all the stops on this one of the most driving, intense songs in Hayes's catalog. Chris?
Yeah, even funkier than Three Tough Guys. Just that skittering frenetic guitar, like really punchy horns, big time scene setting music. I mean, the song sounds like a danger siren should be accompanying it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
just has that just real badassness to it.
Mm. Next, Barbara Mason with Sheba Baby from the movie Sheba Baby with a comma in the middle from 1975. Here's another Pam Grier film, but there's nothing of the usual with this song from the soundtrack. A futuristic synthesizer riff leads an aggressively playful string section that brings in what can be called a sensuous funk track. Mason sings it with the requisite authority and accentuates the hooks in the chorus. Chris?
Yeah, I see this as being disco.
Okay.
I think this song kind of segues into disco because of the synthesizer and because of the beat and because of the singing. I see this as being sort of like an early disco song, and it's transitional. That a lot of this stuff has been kind of like funk and soul,
Yeah.
whereas this is like pure disco. And by this point, this is a Pam Grier vehicle. You're now in year three of the Pam Grier phenomenon. You really had to bring it if you're
Yeah.
going to do the theme music or the soundtrack to a Pam
Yeah.
Grier movie.
Right.
And Barbara Mason brings it and then some. Great
Yeah.
song.
Yeah. And the final song on our list, The Staple Singers with Let's Do It Again from the movie Let's Do It Again, 1975. We end this list appropriately enough with Curtis Mayfield, who wrote all the music for this action crime comedy film that starred Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby. The staple singers by this time were legendary in gospel and had crossed over into secular R&B and soul music a while ago. And Mayfield wrote this song particularly with them in mind.
Yep.
Mid-tempo, slightly funky love songs have always been one of Mayfield's considerable strengths. And with Mavis Staples' rich, voluptuous voice singing lead, she lends the track a sexual, sensual potency that's irresistible. Chris?
Yeah, and the thing about the song is it's really simple and it's really joyful in its tune.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a simple, joyful tune about sensuality sung by Mavis Staples and written by Curtis Mayfield. Literally nothing can go wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you said Mayfield was, again, he had a real gift for this too. That he was able to stay within this blaxploitation. Like him and Isaac Hayes just had a gift for being able to have that sort of cinematic touch when it came to writing for these movies, and in some ways, especially Mayfield probably more than Hayes, really capturing the black experience in a way that was dignified.
Yeah, that was his whole thing, right? Keep your head up, that was his whole thing.
Yep.
Absolutely. All right, now we end this list here for a reason. By the middle and toward the end of the 1970s, blaxploitation films had become so prevalent and spread out in their production quality, from the biggest major production studios to the smallest low-budget indie companies, that attention to the music of these movies started to shift. As more and more smaller, more independent production companies made these movies, the budgets got smaller, and hence less of a reliance on major names and artists in R&B, soul, and funk for the soundtracks. The music went from more song-based soundtracks, like we've been talking about, to more generic score-based soundtracks. And then by the end of the 1970s, blaxploitation films had begun to decline in popularity because, lo and behold, there was all of a sudden a slow but steady increase in the appearance of black actors in big Hollywood movies in roles both large and small. Chris, what do you say about the decline of blaxploitation films and, by extension, the soundtrack music of the genre?
I think it's pretty much inevitable. For the reasons that you said. I think that Hollywood had its fill of blaxploitation, and it's like anything else. There's a reason it's called blaxploitation. It's the root word is exploitation.
Yeah.
They were exploited to the point where they weren't eventually going to win. Hollywood got as much out of them as they could, and it inevitably was going to fall off, and inevitably was going to go into the sea. And like you said, black actors became more acceptable as support players in more major films. And so again, you didn't have the talent. The directors were also becoming more accepted. The Gordon Parkses and some of those folks. And so, with the loss of the talent, it just makes sense that and any time, well, that's been the history of sort of black success in this country. Anytime that something has become successful or innovated by black people, white people steal it, and white people ruin it, and that's pretty much what happened here.
Yeah. But anyway, we have the music to remind us of this brilliant period. And some of this, like I said, some of the best R&B, soul, and funk music of the 1970s were in the soundtracks to these movies. And two of those soundtracks are two of the greatest albums ever made, period. We spoke about one of them already, and we will speak about the other one in the next episode. Speaking of which, folks, we hope you get excited for our next episode as we finalize our second Golden Age of Rock series as we focus on 1972. You've already heard the promo for it. I'm excited to end this series because I'm going to talk a lot about some of my favorite albums.
Yeah, and I am too. I'm really looking forward to saying goodbye to the second Golden Age of Rock and ending it with 72. Exile on Main Street. Enough said.
Exactly.
Yep. And with that, folks, as we always do at the end of these episodes, we encourage you to join our Curmudgeonly community on Facebook. Good times had up there. Arturo's been posting quite a bit lately. I'm going to get back in rotation here soon, I promise. And you can catch us there at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. The group is invite only, but chances are we'll let you in. We'd love to have you. The more the merrier. If you disagree with anything that we've had to say here, if you agree with anything, if you have your favorite Blaxploitation era song that we did not mention, feel free to hit us up at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And, we'd love to have the correspondence. And then, as always, we're going to commemorate these songs and we're going to memorialize them in a Spotify playlist. And the link to that will be available in the description on Apple or Stitcher or wherever else you get your podcast. Look in the episode description. There'll be a link, and you'll be able to enjoy these in real time as you listen to our episode. You can check out the music. It's a special thing, man.